Hey, folks, welcome. Thanks for joining me. Please take a second to click the thumbs up, click the subscribe, share it, all that good stuff. I'm also live on Rockfin. I have an incredible guest for you today, which I'm very excited about. Um, let's see if I can get Rockfin going here. I mean, you all know him and his tremendous work. So many best-selling, amazing books that have been pivotal in my life. Also, his interview show on Contact that ran for several years. All of that shut down recently, which we'll get into. But yeah, it doesn't need much more introduction than that. Please welcome Chris Hedges.
Hey, thanks, Lee.
Hey, thanks for being here.
Sure.
Strange times, but perhaps not unexpected.
No, it's not unexpected. I think all of us who've been following it have watched this steady progression of marginalization, demonization, and censorship. I was very vocal in opposing the deplatforming of Trump for this very reason. You don't want to give these large tech monopolies, which are completely opaque. We know nothing about them. They know everything about us. The power of wholesale censorship, because they're hardly going to stop with Alex Jones or Trump. And I didn't expect to be a victim quite so quickly. But I had already been hit with their shadow banning, as you have, and algorithms. That's not conjecture, by the way. Of course, it's all, it's not public. But that last year, I was at Truthdig before we were all fired for trying to form a union and stop the publisher from firing Bob Scheer. I do have a very bad habit of sort of clashing with one institution after another.
Right.
The IT people did a study of referrals by impressions, which so you type imperialism into Google, and if I'd written something on it, we'll come up with anything else that was recent. And referrals from impressions declined from over 700,000 to below 200,000. So that was already going on. The whole prop or not, propaganda or not, this anonymous website that attacked left-wing sites.
Well, and the brilliance of shadow banning is that it because you often can't point to it and say it's been done, even though it's obvious.
Right.
I went from gaining 5,000 subscribers on Facebook a day to gaining 0 every day for 5 years. The New York Times recently, after RT closed, and they wrote an article about it, said Lee Camp, with his numbers flagging, believed he was shadow banned. So,
well, yes. Well, isn't that classic? I worked there for 15 years. I know how it works.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you do have a longer history than I of getting kind of purged or forced out of these institutions for your speech, for the things you're saying. I mean, you were kind of forced out of the New York Times despite winning a Pulitzer Prize after you started speaking out against the Iraq invasion, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then RT America, for I think everyone watching probably already knows, but shut down in the span of a day. And I don't exactly know the reasons, but it seems pretty evident it was connected to U.S. sanctions. And on top of that, all of our past episodes banned globally. So years of episodes. You wrote a great article on what was lost. I mean, this is kind of the digital version of burning of books.
Yeah, it's kind of like Stalinist airbrushing. Trotsky's in the photo and then he isn't. That's how totalitarian societies work. You exist and then suddenly you don't. Look, I mean, with my show, it was this one, it. It was this wonky show where I read books and interviewed the authors. There was not one show on Russia. In fact, the few times that Russia was mentioned, or Putin, I was not flattering. Matt Taibbi wrote a nice piece about it and linked to a show with Alan Nairn. He was kind of pretty rough on Russia. So, but that's not the point. That's not why they shut it down. I mean, we know from the Director of National Intelligence report in 2017 why they targeted and eventually shut down RT. It had zero to do with Russian propaganda. It had to do with the fact that RT was giving a voice to, these are their words, Occupy activists, anti-fracking activists, Black Lives Matter activists, third-party candidates. That's why they marginalize you. I mean, this is how it works. They marginalize you, they force you into a particular space, and then they demonize that space. So, for instance, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I was in the Magic Lantern Theater in Prague every night with Václav Havel. The only way you could hear Havel was on Voice of America. Then, of course, that allowed the communist government to paint him as a stooge of the West. Or you go back and look at Bob Scheer. He runs the great Post website, Scheer Post. I write a column there every Monday. And he ran Ramparts. Well, they blocked the advertising from Ramparts. It's a very funny story about Bob taking a Pan Am Airlines ad off the back of Time magazine or something and putting it on the back of Ramparts so he could show it to potential advertisers and give himself some respectability. And of course, what happened was Pan Am sued him to take it off. But that's always the case. And so, especially in my case, if you're a strong supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, if you're a sharp critic, as I have long been, of the Democratic Party, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and look, I would have been pushed out of RT. I wrote a very strong column denouncing the invasion of Ukraine as preemptive, a criminal act of aggression. Preemptive war is under post-Nuremberg laws an act of. I don't think I would have been able to stay. It went dark 6 days later, but I can't imagine that Moscow would have looked very kindly on that very vocal condemnation of the war. It didn't happen, and so that's conjecture. But the walls are really closing in. I go all the way back. I started as a reporter covering the wars in Central America in the 1980s.
But just real quick, I know you're saying they would have not looked favorably on it, but through my entire time there, as you said, you had some harsh anti-Putin stuff earlier. I was never censored. I was never told what to say.
Yeah, no, I wasn't either.
I think the same was true for you. So it is true they might not have liked that, but
well, Moscow definitely wouldn't have liked it. I mean, whether they would have swallowed it, I don't know. That's conjecture, but they definitely wouldn't have liked it. But I certainly, when I made that statement, was aware that I was potentially antagonizing RT. But I can't denounce preemptive war in Iraq and then not denounce preemptive war in Ukraine. With this caveat, as I said, I was in Eastern Europe in 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there was universal understanding that expanding NATO, of course, we all thought NATO had been rendered obsolete, which shows you how naive we are, it would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany because it was an unnecessary provocation. In fact, Gorbachev wanted to work out a mutual security alliance, and everyone, I mean, even, the venal Henry Kissinger said that NATO should not be expanded. But it was $1 billion arms bonanza for refitting Soviet bloc militaries with NATO-compatible equipment. They use different caliber. I learned that in Sarajevo. They have like 61 mortars. We have 60s, this kind of stuff. So, and that's what drove it. And we talk about Ukraine not joining NATO. Well, that's really kind of shadowy because Ukraine is a de facto NATO country. It's awash in NATO weapons. Had 150 NATO military advisors. Of course, Biden just admitted that we're training Ukrainian troops in Poland. So this doesn't excuse what Russia did, but it was completely predictable. And there was a column I wrote a couple of weeks ago where I quoted a 2008 WikiLeaks cable that had been leaked, written out of Moscow, that predicted precisely what would happen, including the fact that Ukraine would be the flashpoint. So it was all understood, but it was, I really think, done for profit and perhaps this assertion of U.S. global hegemony. But it was very foolish. It was unnecessary. I don't think that Russia would have invaded the Ukraine if we had honored our promise not to expand NATO. And under the Clinton administration, of course, we promised that we would not station NATO troops in Eastern Europe, another broken agreement.
Yeah, and it seemed evident that the U.S. is losing a grasp on our hegemony, and they're a lot of things showing that the petrodollars being dropped in some instances, the trade with China is now of nations is now far larger than trade with the U.S. We're kind of just losing our economic stranglehold on the world, and so I think a lot of that plays into what's going on right now. But like you said, like you mentioned, the Ukraine. I want to play this real 1 minute clip. This is your colleagues, journalists, but these are the ones that are allowed in the White House press corps room. And this is a clip of them all demanding that the White House basically arm Ukraine more and push us closer to nuclear war.
Than what Ukrainian officials are saying they need the most.
It sounds like, we're pretty dug in on our position when it comes to the no-fly zone, when it comes to the MiGs, despite this growing bipartisan call in Congress to shift a little bit. So to put it bluntly, is Zelensky wasting his time tomorrow asking for these things?
President Zelensky is going to be speaking to Congress tomorrow. He's been pushing for fighter jets, a no-fly zone. You have to hear some of those same requests tomorrow as well. Has the administration shifted on that at all?
Really, though, calling for a no-fly zone. They're a NATO member. They share a border with Russia. How do we view their calls for a no-fly zone?
And on President Zelensky's address tomorrow, of course, he is expected to ask for more assistance, as my colleague noted. A lot of the U.S. positions on that haven't changed, as you just said, when it comes to the no-fly zone. But on the aircraft specifically, the Pentagon said last week that Secretary Austin said they do not support the transfer of fighter aircraft at this time. Is that still the United States?
So you get the point that they are just endlessly pressuring the administration to have a no-fly zone, to send more weapons over there. I mean, it's insanity from my point of view.
Well, a no-fly zone is an act of war because it means you dominate the airspace, and if Russia attempts to violate it, you shoot down their MiGs. That's war. Even the Biden administration doesn't want to go to war. But in terms of weapons, sure. The idea is to turn it into Chechnya or turn it into the old Afghanistan, where, very cynically, you make Russia bleed. But of course, the people who really are bled are the Ukrainians. That's the goal, to create a quagmire. And the amount of weaponry that is being pumped into the Ukraine from the EU and NATO is just mind-boggling. Germany has lifted its ban on the exportation of weapons, has doubled its defense budget, has said that it will now devote 2% of GDP to defense. That will make Germany the third largest military in the world after China and the United States. It's just insanity. And by shutting down Russian media, of course, you're not going to hear the Russian position. The fact is, Russia has many legitimate grievances, including, I would argue, a demand that Ukraine remain neutral, given Russia's history, especially after the fact of the Nazi invasion in World War II, which devastated the country. And a century before that, Napoleon did the same thing. So they don't look at NATO. Nobody in the Middle East looks at NATO as a defensive force. Go try saying that in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's an aggressive entity, and it's been aggressive in Eastern Europe, stationing missile bases 100 miles from the border of Russia in Romania and in Poland. This is nuts. I mean, we almost had a nuclear showdown over Soviet missiles in Cuba, which are 90 miles from the coast of Florida. It's just the inability to see the world from the perspective of the other, and of course, what's even worse is we can't acknowledge the legitimacy of these viewpoints. I mean, this gets into the whole collapse of foreign reporting, which is what I did. A good foreign reporter is culturally, linguistically, historically, religiously literate. You understand, you explain how another society sees you the way they do, why they see you the way they do, and you give their voice. But of course, all of that's been eradicated for the kind of cheap nationalist cant defines the Ukraine crisis and, frankly, defined the whole war in Iraq. We forget how lonely it was for those of us who stood up to defy that war.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak, since you've been in wars, you've reported from wars, you've seen it firsthand. I was wondering if you could speak to the power of the far right, nationalist, very violent groups that pop up. Obviously, we've seen that in Ukraine since, I mean, even before, but definitely since the 2014 U.S.-backed Maidan coup. These Nazi forces that apparently mainstream media in America is now telling us to support them. Can you speak to their influence and their power by using violence?
Well, so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a resurrection of these fascist forces. I lived in Zagreb in Croatia, which openly embraced the Ustasha, the fascist client state under the Nazis. But I also covered Romania, for instance, and the old Iron Guard couldn't resurrect itself fast enough after the fall of Ceausescu. In fact, I interviewed the head of the party. They renamed themselves the Peasant Party, I believe, if I remember correctly. And this guy had been an officer at Stalingrad. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. He came into the office wearing a long black leather coat. So yes, there was immediately after the fall, because if you go back and look at the history in Eastern Europe, Stalin was quite ruthless against nationalist movements. Unlike Lenin, there was a difference there. And these nationalist movements were suppressed in places like the Ukraine, so that with the advent of World War II, these nationalist movements gravitated quite seamlessly into the arms of the fascists. And there was huge collaboration, especially with the Ukrainians. I don't remember the exact percentage, but a large percentage of them were camp guards. They joined SS battalions. And then you see, with the fall of communism, a resurgence. I have not been to the Ukraine, but it's my understanding that these old fascist forces have their own cemeteries, and most of the Jews that they killed are still lying in unmarked mass graves, or they might have, a small memorial or something at Babi Yar. I don't know, but so yes, that resurgence of fascism is real. You have a significant part of the population that looks back on that fascist era with admiration and respect. And of course, we have fascist parties and fascist militias in the Ukraine. I'm not saying every Ukrainian's a fascist, but it's there. It's real.
Yeah, yeah. I believe Scott Ritter's point was that they may not make up that larger percentage of even the Ukrainian military, but they are so aggressively violent that they are the ones that lead the way, and they are the ones the politicians fear. So many of the politicians won't do anything that's going to alienate or offend the Nazi contingent in the military. I also wanted to talk about how this war that obviously Russia started in the sense of actively bombing and invading, but it serves as a beautiful distraction for the Biden administration, Congress in general, in terms of what's going on here domestically. I mean, while this goes on, there is zero discussion of our ridiculous and awful prison state. There's zero discussion of climate change. It's so many things that are just completely ignored during a time of, wall-to-wall coverage of whether it's this or the invasion of Iraq or whatever.
Well, sure. Well, the Biden administration has been a disaster. It hasn't even managed to fulfill its most basic campaign promises of $15 minimum wage or forgiving student loans. Its Build Back Better bill is gutted and destroyed. All of the support that actually came out of the Trump administration, the $2,000 checks, the moratoriums on foreclosures and bank repossessions, the child tax credits, supplementing unemployment, which is running out now, all of that is being lifted. So things are getting worse economically. There's a refusal, I would argue, on the part of the Democratic Party, because, of course, they're beholden to corporate power to push through the kinds of reforms and establish the kinds of programs that would ameliorate the very real suffering, which of course only fuels the proto-fascist or Christian fascists and the cult-like Republican Party. But remember that it's a unified Democratic and old Republican Party establishment that is now working together against this kind of right-wing populism, if we want to use that term. So Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney, they're all basically bonded now with the Democratic Party, Crystal and all these other figures. And it very much reminds me of 1932 in Germany, where there's a great fear by the aristocratic class of the Nazis, with legitimate fear. And so von Papen comes into power, and all he does is try to recreate the Ancien regime without passing through the radical social legislation that might have been able to stave off fascism. In fact, because of the crash, they owed international banks so much money, they canceled unemployment insurance. And that's a very similar kind of phenomena. So they're not dealing with the structural issues that have created these political distortions. What they're doing is trying to silence people like you and me who point it out. That is not going to play out well. I mean, I think even the Democratic Party leadership understands they're going to get shellacked in the midterms. And if we keep going like this, we're going to end up with Trump or a Trump wannabe, with this difference. These people are going to come back with a campaign of unmitigated vengeance. It's going to be a very ugly period in American history.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I want to let people know where you continue to do your work, because even on my live streams, people keep asking where they can find your stuff.
I did what my friends Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi did. I went to Substack. So if I get enough subscribers, then I will continue to write my weekly column for SheerPost. Bob doesn't have any money, runs that thing out of his Social Security check. And then we'll reconstitute my television show. So that's the goal. So it's chrishedges.substack.com.
chrishedges.substack.com. Thank you so much, Chris. I hope to talk to you again in not too long.
Great. Thanks for doing it, Lee.
Thank you. All right, there is Chris Hedges, the always amazing Chris Hedges. If you haven't read his books, you must do that immediately, because they are so incredible, and they will shift your entire view of American empire. At minimum, that's the minimum you'll get from his excellent work. So yeah, support him on Substack. My stuff is at patreon.com/Lee Camp. Obviously both of us have had our shows shut down, have had our past YouTube videos banned, I've had my podcast deleted from Spotify. So we are relying on you guys to help us continue our work. So mine's patreon.com/Lee Camp. And what do I have coming up for you? If you didn't catch my last 8-minute video on central banking and what's going on with American hegemony and the petrodollar on that front, please check it out. That's also at patreon.com/Lee Camp. And keep fighting.